Okay, welcome to the afternoon of the first day of the MTS 2024. So we have an exciting program this afternoon. I will let our next speaker introduce that, but I do have a couple of housekeeping items to talk about. This afternoon after the session, we have the coffee break from 4:30 to 5, and then after the at 6 o'clock we have an ice cream social. So you get to make your own. You get to be an engineering contest because you get to build your own ice cream. So, ice cream sundae, yes. And then tomorrow we have our tech tracks. In the exhibition hall in the middle. Those are kind of fun. They're open to anybody that's got a ticket here or, just for the exhibition hall. And they're little half-hour sessions that are going to be talking about various, different things where you have a little bit more interactive, dynamic. Let's see. What was the other thing I need to mention? Oh, the application. So if you haven't already downloaded the application for the conference that has the program and some of the resources, be a little bit careful because the QR code that's on the little block, the sign that's downstairs, you can download the app, but it loads up like a program from like 3 years ago. So once you've downloaded the app and installed it, scan the code again and it'll connect you to the current one. Or you can go in and search for the current year's program. Next year we'll make sure that we've taken down all the old stuff, but this one is it's still there. So to get into the app, there's no password for the app, but there's a password for the Wi-Fi. Is that what you're looking for? Oh, well, you're screwed. Sorry. But last year was called MTS as well, so you should probably say MTS 2024, and it'll get the current one. Yes.
Free to think about it for 2022, but it still got a new problem.
So my advice, keep trying until you get it right. That's probably the best thing I can tell you. All right. Well, without further ado, I'd like to introduce again our president, Renard Jenkins.
Thank you, Dickson.
Thank you.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us, and hopefully, as many of you can stay awake after lunch as possible. We are about to go deep into science, color imaging, and a lot of really fun stuff. I get the pleasure of introducing this incredible group of talented individuals, who are artists as well as scientists. And they are also creatives as well as production professionals. And that is what typically we refer to as a unicorn in this business, but it is quickly becoming the standard. Individuals who can actually do much more than what you are originally expecting them to do when they come on set or when they are actually in the lab. So a few of the things that we're going to go over today is color principles for digital imaging, how to achieve correct color rendition from cameras, LED lights, and other production tools, how to accurately present and preserve skin tones, and how many of you are old enough to remember the Kelly card? You guys remember? See, yeah. There's now I ask how many of you are old enough to remember that. However, if you are a person, especially if you're part of David Long's RIT, color science team, you know that no matter what age you are, because they are, I mean, look, I'll give RIT it's flowers. They are just cranking out color scientists, and they're all good. So, and we're going to get to hear from one of them today. But the other thing that we're going to talk about is post-production as well. And so I get the wonderful pleasure of introducing, a friend of, at this point, over 30 years. Christian Epps and I, essentially started in the business when we were toddlers, and he and I, between us, have hundreds of credits. We have at least 50 credits together. So I've had the opportunity to work with him on some really incredible stuff. Christian has worked in both television. He has worked in, feature film. He has worked in Broadway or on Broadway. He has also done lighting design, for famous, acts such as Michael Jackson, and a number of other, really commercially successful folks. He was also, a part of the incredible group that put together the movie Selma and all of its award-winning visuals and so forth. So with that, I'm going to introduce Christian. He's going to show you what this incredible group of people have been working on. And I really do think this is going to be an enlightening thing. And by the way, just so you know how important color science has become and how much of more than a buzzword it is, our SMPTE wall chart that was released, Jacqueline and her team on the editorial group released this chart in our last journal. It is the most requested chart that we have had in the last 5 years. That shows you how important color science is. So let's all sit back. Let's get ready to do some math and, let's get ready to learn and understand some really cool science.
So they didn't know. Hello, everybody. Thanks for having me. Christian Epps. I'm the founder of Lights Camera Diaspora and, working in the business in various forms, as Renard mentioned, for a little over 4 years. And, I'm pleased to say that I had the good sense to invite 4 of my closest friends to help do, a lot of the lifting on the art and the science of color. The main reason I'm interested in that at this point is, I had a moment where I was scouting a project. Somebody had just come from another scout, and they had run into a young DP who did not recognize a tungsten Fresnel. And I thought, what are we doing when we don't recognize major elements of the industry visually, right? Now, everybody in this room doesn't necessarily need to know all the ins and outs, but it affects everyone in this room. The fidelity to which we recreate these images is our job. We are not here just for fiber. We're not here just for, processors. We're not here for LED chips. We're not here for Fresnels. We're here for proper representation of our ideas. And so I'm very interested in making sure that we use color, which is, I believe, our strongest weapon. If I had to choose one thing out of all the elements that show up on a screen, if budget reduces, if time reduces, if you discuss what is emotionally the most impactful on a viewing audience, my contention is that color is the main thing that transmits the emotion the best in terms of humans and visual language. So I'm interested now if we'll bring Catherine Meininger, a color scientist from Portrait Displays. And Catherine is going to talk to us about color science and what we're actually seeing. And we look forward to that. Thank you, Catherine.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Christian. Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. I hope you all had a great lunch. I am in charge of a 15-minute color science primer for you all today. So this is usually I take about 45 minutes, 50 minutes to try to encapsulate this topic. So today you get a 15-minute version of that. But I hope that you're able to walk away from my session of this, with a good base understanding that will allow you to think a little bit deeper as you see each of our following, awesome speakers today, and keep these principles in your mind as you're going through that. So as we were mentioning before, so I'm here to talk about some color principles for digital imaging and color management. And the overall session of this talk is about color rendition. So to start off that conversation, let's chat about what exactly we mean by color rendition. I've lately been liking to find some definitions kind of start these conversations. So the official definition that I went ahead and grabbed from the CIE International Lighting Vocabulary. Color rendition is the effect of an illuminant on the color appearance of objects by conscious or subconscious comparison with their color appearance under a reference illuminant. So in simplifying some of those terms, right, we have an object that can look different depending on what light source you may be showing on it. And in particular, we're curious about how similar those might look for two given illuminants. So let's take a step back with this definition in mind for the remainder of this presentation here and go back to some good old basic color physics. So let's talk about what color is and how color gets formed and how illuminants create these different color appearances. So let's start off with, a source, an object, and then we'll get to exactly what happens from there. The light source in particular we're going to start off the conversation with is the sun, the light source that we interact with every single day of our lives. In particular, this is a distribution of CIE illuminant D65. This is the particular form of daylight that the motion picture industry likes to use. So to introduce some of these concepts, what I want you to really take away from this is we have a definition of some wavelengths. In particular here, we're looking at visible wavelengths that are relevant to human perception. And at each one of those wavelengths, there's some amount of energy and power that's coming from that light source. Going into our objects, in this instance, I've picked a wonderful human model that I get to stare at almost every single day at portrait displays, that has some amount of light reflectance. And there's other properties there that objects will have, but for the sake of keeping a conversation simple, we'll stick to reflectance. So there is some amount of light or power that is reflected off of an object at each of those wavelengths. And so mathematically, we multiply these things together, and that gives us our resulting color stimulus. So it has attributes of both of those spectrums put together, and we see those areas where there is going to be less available power at certain wavelengths and more at others. But ultimately, it's that combination of each of these two. So continuing on to talk about different illuminants, let's go ahead and pick a different one. Let's pick a tungsten illuminant. Here we are going to keep that same object. We've changed our light distribution. It's one that still has a decent amount of power at all wavelengths. As we know with tungsten lights, there's maybe not a lot of blue energy, but it's a very warm tone, as we can see through those longer wavelengths. So when we combine these two objects, we get a spectrum that is the combination of the both, but this time we have far less blue present and a lot more of those longer wavelengths. So there's a third light source that we're going to compare today, focusing on, what we're talking about here with LED lights. And so let's pick one of those. This is just a representation of a possible LED light that has some red, green, and blue components. And the important thing to note here, right, is now we're losing that more broad range of power across all those wavelengths. So this time when we interact with our object, we are losing those wavelengths, and that resulting color stimulus doesn't have the same broad wavelengths there. So we are losing some of those yellows, those oranges, some of the intermediates between blue and green. So things that we're seeing naturally in our day-to-day experiences, looking at human skin tones, things that create that sense of liveliness, could be affected depending on exactly what kind of LED distributions that you see. And so if you attended the earlier virtual production primer at the beginning of the day today in this room, we talked about how different power distributions have those different effects on a color chart on human skin tone appearance. So here's your mathematical science version that doesn't necessarily have a pretty picture, but communicates how we're looking at that mathematically and leads into how we start to quantify these things. So we know in this particular instance, when we're using LED lights, it tends to really emphasize that red portion of those wavelengths. So skin tones can become a lot more red, and we lose some of that naturalness there. Or you see it in objects, they seem to pop a lot more with color depending on what LEDs you use. So I don't have a spectrum reflected in my slides today, but you can start seeing LED panels on the market now that are looking to add more primaries, adding white subpixels, cyan, yellow, something to fill out these spaces in those wavelengths. So we can get back to something, for instance, when we go back to our tungsten spectrum that fills in those missing wavelengths. So at this point, all that we've been talking about is power and wavelength and some math and some science. At no point has this become color yet until you've actually introduced a human eye into the equation. And perhaps there's like a debate there amongst color scientists of what's color, what's light. But for the sake of this conversation, right, we have not yet perceived anything. So the last little nugget of math to add here is some way to model how we're perceiving that color, how we're detecting that color. So there's another multiplication that would happen here that summarizes that spectrum into, in this instance, what we call XYZ tristimulus values. And that gives us some sensation of what that color is for us. And then that basis of XYZ is what leads into many of the different color representations that you've probably seen, like chromaticity diagrams, things that start talking about chroma and hue, other visible attributes. But for the sake of trying to quantify and model color, this is where that starting foundation is. And not only about how we're quantifying that, but the whole process of human perception is how we're basing all of our color imaging systems off of through some sort of imaging chain. So in the instance of just human perception, we've had some stimuli that interacted with a light source and some object reflectance. Then that's come through our eyes and our brain has processed that and it creates our sensation of vision, which is our perception in this instance. So we can then take that whole experience into those three sections of some sort of stimulus, something that captures and prepares that information and then presents it somewhere, and that's how we get to our digital color imaging systems. So here I've now summarized as a stimulus because, in my opinion, it is not yet a color. It is simply still some light output, but we're going to introduce a camera into the equation. So instead of having color matching functions from a human eye, we now have some spectral sensitivities, which follow some of those same principles. There's some different detectors that are looking for specific wavelengths of light, but these are designed specifically for how an electronic sensor is going to receive that information and collect enough energy to create a reasonable picture. We then have to process that somehow and store that information, let's say in an image file. And so in this example, maybe we've converted that to some RGB triplets that have some particular meaning. And ultimately, the part where it actually then becomes color is once we put it on a display and we get to have yet another form of light energy and some form of color that we will then see, where the ability for us to, perceive that color through all of these chains comes from metamerism. And being able to view those colors the same ways on different display technologies that have different light sources are what allow that color to go from that beginning of capture all the way through the end so we can have a consistent viewing experience. So at this point, we've covered some basic color physics principles and how we get into imaging systems and what those designs are. So let's, roll it back to why is it that we're here again? And it's about quantifying color rendition. So pulling up that definition from before, we're talking about those effects of illuminance and how they affect color appearance. So we're picking our two different spectrums, one that's caused by a tungsten light source, one that's caused by our LED light source. And as we've seen from either our own experiences or other conversations or presentations you've seen earlier in the day, they're going to look a little bit different. But how different? And my other question there is by who and by what? So in these imaging chains, we've talked about an eye seeing that color. We've talked about a camera seeing that color. And then we've talked about a eye seeing the color after it's been captured on another display. So what color rendition is it that we're referring to? And so at the end of the day, there's quite a few different metrics, and it's important to understand what those are, what they represent, and then how you can use those to determine which value it is that you're actually looking for. The first one to highlight is one that maybe comes to mind that you've seen before, CRI, or Color Rendering Index. This was defined by the CIE, and this basically is describing a calculation of how we would perceive those color differences based on different estimations of different color samples. There's a selection of a few different reflectances for color patches. You calculate what those perceived color differences are through all the modeling that we can do, and then compare those against one sort of spectrum and against another. And that gives you some aspect of what those differences are. But some things that have been acknowledged about that particular metric is that the color space that it was used to calculate all those and estimate perception has some flaws. It isn't the best perceptually uniform color space and has some other issues that if you've seen previous talks that I've given about delta E formulas, there's just some differences in modeling that need to get accounted for. And this especially has shown up when we've tried to introduce this for LED light sources. So since then, it took quite a while, but eventually there was another metric that the CIE eventually standardized, which is the color fidelity index, which at the end of the day is still a similar calculation, but it tried to address those flaws. It uses a different color appearance model that's in a more perceptually uniform color space, and it looked to create a better distribution of color samples to do this calculation from. That way it could have a better sampling of how different illuminants might affect different objects. But all that we've talked about here is just perceived color differences from your eye. We haven't yet talked about any of the other scenarios. So we can get it to another form of color rendition that comes from the Television Lighting Consistency Index. So this comes from 2012, where we start to then introduce that process of a display being or a camera capture showing something on a display that's being perceived by a person. In this instance, they picked a color checker, which most of us are probably very familiar with, used that as the reflectance sample set, and then went and modeled that through a camera capture display reproduction, and then someone perceiving that. So with that being said, there's some presumptions that are made there, where there's an assumed set of camera spectral sensitivities and display primaries, which is not going to be representative of all motion picture workflows that are out there. So we've gotten a little closer to what we're trying to do in a motion picture capture, but there's still some flaws there that might not apply for everyone. So the last metric, that's the most recent, is the Spectral Similarity Index, which is published in SMPTE ST 2122. Where we are doing just a direct comparison of those radiometric spectral characteristics we've been talking about. So in this instance, we've removed any dependency on trying to model stimuli in a display capture or in a perception. We're just looking at the beginning portion of this. And to, add some complexity here, all of these scales are pretty much numerically the same. But it's important to understand the meaning behind these color spaces and their calculations so that you can derive the right interpretation from them. And that's true for nearly any color equation and any color difference formula that you're going to see. Make sure you really understand what space you're working in, and that's going to lead you to your best use of that information. So the reason why Spectral Similarity Index is a powerful solution to this problem is because it gets right to the source at the very beginning of the imaging chain. So if you can have a light source that is fairly spectrally similar from the beginning, any differences that you have in your capture stage and your display primaries, those are all minimized, and you don't have to worry about collecting all that data and having to model it. Could you if you want to? Absolutely. But this is a way that gets right to the source, the least amount of data and numbers you have to crunch, and gives you a best sensation of how one illuminant might work for a particular production scenario. Because at the end of the day, what we're looking for is some color managed system. You might have different cameras that have different spectral sensitivities. You're passing this around to different vendors in post-production, and you're eventually just trying to get to that final image that you want to go through various forms of distribution. And all of this is in an effort to make sure that that experience that you envisioned right from when you were capturing your scene on set all the way through to the person who's watching it, whether they're in a theater, at home, or looking on their mobile device, that they're getting that emotion that you wanted them to feel. And so, in the greater scheme of color management, and then to blast through everything that happens at the end here, which I know all my speakers following up will be able to dive more into these details, let's speak a little bit more to how this color management happens from that capture stage all the way through that end. There's a bunch of transform blocks that are there. So one of those first things is being able to understand, now that I have this image data and I have these color values, what is it that they're representing? So making sure that we understand the device color space that we're operating in and what those transfer functions were, whether that's coming from the camera or through your intermediate stages in post-production out to your display. These are what your transforms are relying on to create that consistent color experience. And then from there, when we're looking to make sure that we have all these things set up, there's two questions I like to ask for verifying that color management. Is that, are the values of the image data that I have are reflecting the color encoding that I'm expecting to see there? Am I doing that right interpretation? And then lastly, the part that's my favorite is the color that I'm looking at actually the color that I'm expecting to see? So some tools that you'll see used in the following up presentations after me, test charts. Our favorite, especially here at SMT, yes? Right, so that you can use these charts to whether it's testing what your illuminants look like, making sure that your pipelines are set up and your transforms are happening. There's that Kodak image that we were talking about earlier. These get used and can become powerful tools, not just for visual verification, but for data verification. So there are scopes and tools that are made where if you know that you've set up your processing pipelines correctly, you can just quickly look at that data and know that it's right without having to take measurements or do any extra work. The hope of those scopes is you can get a quick bird's eye view. Yes, this is set up right, or you quickly spot something wrong because that scope doesn't look the way that you expect it to. And then lastly, my favorite one that of course I need to end on because I work at a company that does display calibration, making sure that you have a calibrated display. Because if you're going to be making these color critical decisions, you want to make sure that that color that you're looking at is the one that you expect to see. So, grab your favorite validation software, color calibration software, make your own, whatever have you, but make sure that we're going through those calculation processes, that transfer of RGB to XYZ, modeling those delta E's, so that what we're looking at on screen is what we want to be there, and then the hopes that if everyone in the world has a great color calibrated screen, then we all have that consistent visual experience. And with that, there's my 15 minutes or so spiel of quick color science. And thank you.
So before Catherine leaves, let me bring my other gentlemen up here for a moment so they can relax their legs and participate. Come on, they'll be introduced one by one. Come on. Justyn Davis, lighting designer, director of photography, going to more with each person. Brad Dickson, retired lighting director at Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, and Matt Tomlinson, head of color science at Harbor Post-Production House. Any particular questions or comments from you gentlemen about what you've seen or heard?
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
We all have a master's degree.
Hopefully.
Yeah.
Maybe a little more in depth on some of the things, but thanks.
One of the things I found interesting when I saw you previously was the comment about color existing or not existing with the human eye. Could you elaborate on that idea?
Yeah. This is one of the things that is what invoked me into really enjoying color science when I was in school is the philosophical aspect of this. So if we break things down into the fact that what we're talking about is light, energy, electromagnetic radiation bouncing off of objects, if there's not a human eye to see the color, does the color exist? Right. Yeah. And there's other ways to think of that okay, we're only talking about a specific wavelength range. We know that tungsten, for example, gives off a lot of energy in the infrared, but we can't see a human experience.
Right on.
I was just going to say one thing. We're all dealing with color. Good. How many people have been tested for color blindness? Right? That used to be a prerequisite. If you're working with people and you're evaluating color, it'd be good to know if they can see it.
Can I comment on that?
Yeah.
Actually, I teach a class at Loyola Marymount. Your scopes are your best friend all the way. So there is the artistic, vision of this, but you've got backup, and those are your scopes and that's your math, and that's what's going to protect you. Which does lead to me, I would love to have a side conversation because I don't think it's part of this about metamerics, because that is just massively fascinating to me, based on, I would love one day to just do that who sees pink, who sees green test. But I think in general, like I've known colorists who are colorblind, and they can do really amazing matching. But there comes this point where there's a bit of a barrier that goes on, and that's when they just start going into the scopes. It's pretty fascinating. Thank you.
Comments, questions from the audience? Yes, sir. Yes.
So I heard that things that you see aren't really that color. So you're just seeing the reflectance. So if I'm seeing blue, that shirt is actually not blue. It's everything but blue. Is that correct?
I would say that we call it blue because that's how we interpret it. So for example, there's cultures out there that like we have particular names for colors and other cultures will have different names for those colors. And it's different, depending on where you're at. We could be very precise with the color and they may call it something completely different. So again, right, a human cultural experience, when you're trying to put a name to it, I would say. Is it blue? It reflects short wavelengths.
All right, we'll take this next question.
Hello. Great presentation, by the way.
Thank you.
For 15 minutes. Phenomenal. My question to you is, you mentioned two different key terms, digital imaging and digital intermediate. Can you explain the difference for somebody who has no knowledge on it?
Did you say digital media and digital intermediate?
Digital imaging and digital intermediate.
Oh, sure. So when we're talking about digital imaging, I'm specifically referring to capture that is then quantized and communicated through electronic signals. The term digital intermediate is one of those many slides that I took out of this presentation that talks about how we get from a capture stage, so a camera raw, for example, how we process that to eventually become the image that's broadcast. We call that an intermediate stage where we do some color transforms to do other calculations. Maybe that's where we're doing visual effects. It's a mathematical space that allows us to do those things in a way that applies to those color physics.
Perfect. Thank you.
All right. If I may, we'll hold some of the questions till the end. I'm going to make sure we get everybody, and then we'll have a little more Q&A.
Thanks, everyone.
All right. Next up, Brad Dickson, former lighting director at Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, co-creator of WYSIWYG, what I learned.
And we developed WYSIWYG at CBC, but
we
developed WYSIWYG at CBC, but I'm co-creator of the HS scope.
And WYSIWYG is as we discussed today, early step forward in the idea of AI video.
Yeah.
And a lot of other things. So Brad is well known in his world of lighting and testing and scopes, and how that conversation goes in his way of verifying the technical aspects of what we're talking about.
Okay. Well, thank you, everyone. So very quickly, at the CBC, we actually changed a lot of our studios to LED lighting way back in the mid-2000s. We actually we had LED lights commissioned for us. So we've been dealing with LEDs for some time, and to Christian's point, as far as pre-visualization, back in the 1990s, we actually were using Maya, 3D Studio Max. This is the lighting department. So working with the virtual world, working with LED video walls, etc., we've been doing that for some time. Now, I also worked in film. So here's the thing. When I worked in film, I had a color meter. It was a middle color meter too. When I worked in video, and yes, as soon as we turn light into electronic signal, it's video, I use scopes, right? Because that's the whole thing. I can measure my luminance and I can measure my chroma. What do? I use international standards. So if you look at the chart that we have here, what are we going with? ITU value chart, right? It says where red is in that video signal. It says where green is. Now, camera manufacturers may put it a different place. That's fine. But at least I'm starting. There's my int. There's my standard that we're going with too. And SMPTE recognized this chart years ago, right? Okay, so this is what the HF scope is. Basically, when we start talking about how do we measure, how do we evaluate, how do we keep consistency in our color pipeline? Well, camera is my color meter. So we start looking at things like the vector scope, and what I did is I put it horizontally. So now all of my amplitude and phase is all horizontal. So I'm shooting on a Sony Venice, the ITU compliant chart, lit by a tungsten source. That white line up there is basically my hue and saturation or phase and amplitude values generated in the chroma signal of that Sony Venice. So there you go. There is my chroma fingerprint that I need for the Sony Venice to emulate, if I'm going to use an LED, to emulate tungsten. Okay, so now that I've got that, I sit back and said, oh, look at everything else everybody's telling us. Okay, and just a note with regard to TLCI, because I did challenge Alan Roberts on this. TLCI is based on a 3-chip prism camera. It's averaging. Alan, does it relate to a single-chip bare filter camera? No, there's too many variables. So my point is that we're deluged with a number of information, which, as your point, with regards to the eye is really worthwhile. But with regards to the question of how is this going to look on camera? Or conversely, if it's not accurate, what do I need to adjust? That's why I developed the HS scope, because that's what it tells you. Okay, now, as was said, we have LED lights that create spikes. The whole key is getting overlaps, making sure that they're accurate, right? The other thing, too, is, oh, all cameras are the same. They all match. Yeah, I don't think so. Right? They all create their own look. So we're now going to have to turn around and look at the attributes of that light and adjust them individually. Oh, numbers. We all like numbers. Here we go. Here's some numbers. So I turned around and I said, there's 3200K. That's a tungsten source. Well, if we look at the HS scope in the bottom, that is its chroma fingerprint, right? And we sit back and said, okay, there's the phase and amplitude. Good. And, well, let's get a color meter. Let's start lining up this LED light that we've got. Okay, well, I got 2970. Yeah, look on the HS scope. No, not camera saying that's not. Well, let's get closer. Maybe 3196. No. So the point is I can walk out with a color meter. My numbers are going all this and the camera's saying, it's not right. That's why I developed it. Immediately, visually, you don't have to be lighting people. Visually, you can see immediately right away that's not matching. And you see what's wrong and what you need to adjust. And what does that do when all of a sudden a light is inaccurate? Well, it shifts skin tones. Now, I don't mind shifting skin tones creatively if that's your choice. What I don't want is a light to decide that. And it's interesting because you get two different lights, right? Even the light of the same manufacturer, they can produce a different response. So what I want is for post, I want to create spectral harmony throughout the entire pipeline. So let's start with the input, right? Don't worry about fixing it in post, let's fix it in pre. If we can fix everything in post, why don't we shoot it in post? So the bottom line is that we can get it all camera accurate right from the start. And that's how I evaluated all the lights that we got into. We put it on camera and tested it, looked on the scopes. Okay, now a LUT will fix everything, right? Yeah, okay, no. A LUT is global. If I were to light everybody here with 5 separate lights and they're all different and they're all in the same frame, how are we going to correct that with a LUT? Oh, I can make magic windows or, power windows and grab them and do all that stuff. But if I turn around and I make every light spectrally harmonious as far as the response on camera goes, great, then put your LUT in. Experiment, do whatever. You want to do raw, whatever the case is, you're going. Right? So that's my whole goal. And that can be done with the HS scope or just reading the camera chroma signal, but having your reference, your ITU chart reference. Okay, so what does that look like? Well, here's an RGBA LED, and I've got my tungsten reference that I had for the Sony Venice, and it's like, let's adjust. Okay, a little bit too much in the blue. It's all real time, so this is how long it takes to correct. Okay, a little bit here, and if it is off, we can let post know, hey, we're a little bit short in the red or whatever the case is. We can get that specific. And if we need to, everything else can be matched to that. So as we adjust it, okay, that's as close as we can get with that, right? Now, again, if we add in different portions of the spectrum, we might get closer. That's how we can evaluate a light. So a manufacturer might give us a preset, but guess what? That preset may not align to the spectral response that camera expects. And now I used a tungsten source, but hey, you can use, if you want, any other sort of light source you want. So this is what we're basing our reference on. Okay, RGB. Oh yeah, and everybody says, oh, well, let's light with these video walls. No, I don't think so, because essentially I can get a white point, right? But what are all my secondaries? They're not there. And Yeah, you talked about RGBW. It's like, okay, how do I know those are the spectrum that I need to add in? So again, as I start adjusting, we can see specifically what the look is, what we try and fill in. It's like, oh, RGB. Yeah, well, red is pretty well online. And these are acronyms that are used like, oh, it's definite. This is RGB and all that stuff. Well, okay, well, let's look at the green, right? Because it should be, as we know, sitting right on that vector point, right, where green is. Well, let's bring out that green LED and hey, wait a second here. It's gone into cyan. But they said it was green, right? Just like we had with numbers, with CCT and all that sort of stuff. It's like, no, numbers don't, work out that way. So we turn and sit back and say, okay, we'll look at blue. Okay, it's not too bad. But again, don't trust, verify, right? Oh, we don't shift color when we dim. Really? Let's give that a shot. Take a look, right? There it is at full. There it is at about 40%. We can see a shift. Now we've got a whole gel range in our lights. Great, wonderful. Okay. Well, I happen to work with a manufacturer who makes gels. They also make lights. They wanted me to evaluate the stuff because they wanted to get things accurate, right? It's interesting because as we see right here, it's like there is a tungsten source with a Roscoe 52 on it. There's the HS scope reading. Let's take a look on the right over there. There's a light saying it's a Roscoe 52 library. It's not. Immediately you can tell. Now it's interesting, this gel manufacturer who makes lights, they themselves said, yeah, we know that we can hit, and we did testing with their stuff, and a number of them got bang on. They said, we know we can hit a number of our colors exactly, but a number of them we can't. And we're a gel manufacturer. So what the heck is everybody else saying? They've got this whole library of gels that are all accurate. No, you get colors, you get whatever, but you start taking what, XYZ manufacturers, Roscoe 52 and ABC's manufacturers, Roscoe 52, and you put them on camera, they're not the same. You can tell that immediately on the HS scope. Okay. Now, general things, of course, we talked about white balance. Okay, great, wonderful. And there's the starting point, right? There's our camera chroma fingerprint. Now, a lot of people blame stuff on lighting. It's always lighting, right? Lighting, it's looking a little bit green. It's whatever all that sort of stuff. It's like, okay, should you do a black balance out of curiosity? Well, no, white balance. Well, hang on a second, right? Essentially, yeah, it's looking green because essentially in your black levels, right, we're seeing green, right? So again, getting things started from the very beginning accurately. Okay. And again, there's the difference. There's a tungsten light, there's an LED light. As far as the cameras goes, they're looking the same. They're creating the same spectral response. And as a matter of fact, I did a whole presentation at the Virtual Everything Summit. I had a video wall behind me, and because we did pre-visualization at CBC, I work in Unreal. We basically matched to the lighting on stage, calibrated the video wall to that. I matched what we're feeding the source from Unreal to that, so everything was spectrally harmonious. I could measure it in the HS scope. We used the ITU compliant chart. Everything was happy on camera. And black levels, it was all black, right? The other thing too is people say, oh, video walls, oh, we've got blacks. It's like, this is not a darker black than 0, right? You don't have -0 when you're in your waveform. So, and again, now Christian asked me this question, all right, what are the important specs that matter, right? Okay, well, one thing I see is, okay, now I'm co-created the HS scope, that's fine, use any other scope you want. The bottom line is, look at it, the chroma response of the camera. And what should manufacturers start putting out, right? I feel they should start doing the test rather than having people like Justyn and Christian doing the tests with their lights. Show me what tests you've done on camera, right? Because you've given me all this information, but how does it relate to the camera? All right, well, I'm like the city in the Bible. I babble on too much, so I will end this. There we go. Any questions? Okay. Hi. Okay.
Well, go ahead. Any questions or comments for Brad? Anybody?
Okay.
Oh, Matt.
Sure.
So the scopes are awesome. Questions. Yeah. Is it
the scope that you're feeding, that what's feeding the scope is coming through the camera that's capturing the LED light either from the wall or a light, correct?
Yeah. So it's reflecting, right? And even if it's coming from the wall, realize the wall itself is a representation of reflected light. So when I calibrate it to as if it was a reflected light source.
So when you capture it and it's going through your scopes, based on what you were seeing here, especially when you're talking about black levels, I'm under the impression that it's measuring it in display space as opposed to its camera capture space.
No, it's actually taking the SDI signal from the camera itself.
So it is a logarithmic based.
Well, yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Well,
yeah.
With that being said, you were talking about individual cameras. Have you done are there tests that you've done where you're mapping multiple cameras into a common color working space?
Mm-hmm.
And how accurate have you found that to be?
Well, here's the thing. First off, number one, every camera is going to be different, right? So if I'm doing a multi-camera shoot, which we're used to and all that stuff, we'll align the cameras up. Start off as a reference. Here's our reference chart. Let's line them up so they're all matching. That's number one. Okay. Once they're there, then we put the light on and we can evaluate from there. But if we all of a sudden we have 4 different cameras, 4 different looks, then yes, the light itself, I'm going to have to cater to each camera, right? Because it'll be off,
totally.
Right?
Totally.
Yeah. And that's the whole thing. That's one of the downsides. Now, in reality, I told Christian this is where we're going to get to is that if you really want everything great and wonderful, use tungsten light, right? And go from there. Continuous radiator and go from there. So again, realize that the LED is emulating this stuff. Just the way that the camera emulates film. I mean, you change your ISO, the photodiodes in the center doesn't come bigger, right? So.
Thank you.
Question. You touched on it briefly, but I didn't quite get your advice. You've worked on many large shows with multiple sources in the room.
Yeah.
And the idea of doing it all tungsten has so many barriers these days.
Of course. Yeah.
So if I'm assuming that we're working on projects where there are multiple lighting sources, typically the cameras would be one package of one manufacturer, even if they're different models within one package. So I'll assume that they're closer together. But with multiple lighting sources, there's a wide variety of aesthetics that come out of them. How do you suggest the end users deal with that?
Okay. So the end users turn around, go to your manufacturer and said, I don't want to test this on set. Show me your tests on camera. And again, I've just created the HS scope for that. And I have actually worked with LED manufacturers who have actually used the HS scope to evaluate this stuff. Some of them print it out. So, I mean, even if it's not the HS scope, other scope work that they've done, right? And if they haven't done that, yeah, it boils down to you yourself doing the evaluation. And like I say, that's what we did at CBC. Basically, we threw out a lot of sort of stuff that came to us because it didn't make the mark. So that as an end user, it is worthwhile to do a camera test and check it on a scope and evaluate it. But again, I say use an ITU chart as your reference, right? And go from there. That's the downside of the industry. And the problem is that they throw all these numbers at you, right? And like I say, TLCI, okay, based on a 3-chip prism camera, has nothing to turn around and do with regards to a single chip bare filter camera, right? But numbers sound good. And that's why I showed, for example, in the HS scope, the CCT values. All sounds good. CRI all sounds good, right? I remember the IDS came out with CRI and they're mentioning about because of LEDs. And they said, oh no, it doesn't relate to them. And then they pulled that back. So again, there's a lot of fluxes that changes. What's her, Roxana, Pajak? She was the one who found out the math was wrong in the original color science for figuring out how the lights, eye sees, and she remapped that, right? So there's a lot of flux that's happening. Manufacturers deal with light differently. I'm looking at how I correct it on camera, how I make it accurate on camera. So when I give it to post or whatever, it's all spectrally harmonious.
Thank you very much.
Okay, thanks.
Excellent. Okay, next up, Justyn T. Davis. Justyn is director of photography, lighting designer, visual, creative lighting, gaffer, Emmy Award winner, Super Bowl, yes, Apple TV, yeah, a lot of stuff. And I'm very fortunate to have him with us as well. Justyn would like to talk from a more end user point of view of the experiences on set to kind of put a practical case study or use case examples of some of these issues we deal with. Thank you.
Hi. Can you guys hear me? Oh, great. That's my wife. Good afternoon. Here's the slide. All right. So I'm just going to start talking about skin tone and on the waveform. I know we're talking about color, but I think, what Christian's talking about is that fidelity, right? How do we maintain that, right? So when I was taught that, 70 IRE, between 50, and 70 IRE was like a skin tone, right? Just in my practice, I learned that, between like 15 to 45 is a proper skin tone, right? A lighter skin tone is kind of in the higher bracket where it's like, 40, like 35 to 50. And, the lower bracket is probably 15 to about, 30 IRA. That is just some kind of samples of images that I play with, right? I do TV and movies mostly. So, I play in the dark, right? Using a lot of these shadows and, dynamic ways to, produce imagery. So, me playing with these darker sides of the camera, it just allows us to become a little bit more expressive when we're starting to play in these, with these scopes. Just seeing all these dynamic ranges in these images, looking at your whites, but then still looking at your subject, right? Looking where they're all sitting at, right? Still, even though that, we might be in the 70s and 80s in the background, in the foreground, we're still in that same bracket, right? Just using this as an understanding, going back to Ansel Adams and how he used his zone structure to kind of start to create these ideas of, what is an image and how do you create dynamic range in these images, right? Just looking at some examples of Ansel Adams, right? We start to see these, tens, we start to see these, zeros, we start to see these ones, just kind of to create the dynamic range within these images to start to create some kind of a palette, right? So yeah, again, this is just kind of another way to interpret it. I use false color as a way to kind of start to interpret that for myself. It's kind of a shorthand, kind of playing with these numbers, as we keep talking about how we have the black level, which is generally at that 7.5. And then we start going up to the hundreds. But yeah, just looking at the same concept, right? Still looking at the images and looking how we can play with this dynamic range, right? We look at this foreground image where, it looks like a split light kind of scenario, right? We can say that it's dark, but the dynamic range in this image allows us to kind of start to understand that this is like a sunlit room, right? Where we're allowing our optics to kind of play. But the reason why this works, at least in my mind, is that, we have this background that's lit, right? Where we snap this person out of the background so that they stand out a little bit more, with a darker skin tone. And, it's bold, but, that's what makes art. Still playing with that same idea, the fashion commercial that we did. Something similar. And then now playing at the bottom end of that, right? Now looking at this same image, where it's a little bright in here to kind of see the nuance of it, but, still looking at how the skin tone is reading, on a monitor. Utilizing that separation from the background to create a darker foreground. And these are just more examples. Another TV show that I worked on. And then, as we know this is a darker skin tone person with the director standing next to her, right? So it's just understanding that you can kind of push your boundaries a little bit more when you're kind of playing with these scopes, and understanding that, it's more about the science of it, right? Understanding that each camera has a different profile that allows you to go darker or allow yourself to kind of use your dynamic range as a muscle. Similar character, same character, different movie. This is the movie Teal. But yeah, just playing with these numbers and just looking at the skin tone. And for me, it's always like kind of creating a ratio, some kind of dynamic range that allows the image to kind of snap a little bit. An ensemble cast is always a good question. It's like, how do you light this, multiple skin tones in the same scene? I generally use the same rule, right? Light the room. And, when people fall into these spaces, just embrace it. And sometimes, someone sitting next to a window is going to be hotter than someone sitting further away from the window. The hardest part about this scenario is that in this particular setting, these two people are like variant skin tone. She's a lot paler, so she sat closer to that 50, but in that same light, Connie was probably like in the 30s, kind of 40s. So it's like understanding what these skin tones are, understanding them as palettes. So then I'm thinking, well, with that bracket, this person's going to sit higher overall, right? As in the same palette, the darker skinned people are going to be a little bit, lower on that end as well. Similarly, like with someone a lot darker in the same frame, you have to create more dynamic range in the image to kind of snap them out. Similarly with the, dual toned cast, utilizing this kind of understanding of, specular highlights to kind of create some kind of separation as well, but still leaving that, she was kind of still playing in that lower end, right? And he's playing on the higher end in the same lighting scenario. This is the scene that happened before that. Okay, so yeah, same, right? Now we're still looking at these same images, understanding what, we're seeing now. Now we're knowing that we're not going to be afraid of this hitting, 15 IRE on the scope, right? Because we know that she's sitting in a shadow, right? She's a little bit closer to the source, so she might be closer to 20 or 25, right? Similar skin tones, but not being overwhelmed about saying words like dark or underexposed. Because now we have this variance in the frame, right? You have your hundreds in the background, maybe 90s in the background, 70s in the foreground, et cetera, et cetera. Similarly here. I think the thing that I like about this image particularly is because we're exposing to outside, right? Which is, as filmmakers and TV makers, we know that this is something that's really difficult. So I figured that I'd share this with you guys to kind of see how that ability to kind of create that dynamic range within an image can kind of allow you to connect the world. We use like Hopper as references for this show. So like we use a lot of visual references that already existed in the world. We use a lot of like other impressionistic artists as well to kind of express our palette in this show as well. This is a low res image, but this is a comedy show that I did. Still using the same practices. Still using the same practices. Skin tones, highlights, dynamic range. Cool. Sweet. So that's it. Any questions? No? Okay. Cool. Yeah, go, please.
You were talking about false colors. Just out of curiosity, have you played around with Ed Lockman's zones?
I haven't. Everyone always asks me. But the thing that I did do before I even knew about the Ed Lockman app or whatever it is, scopes, I actually watched movies with false color on. Like I watched full movies with false color on.
Really?
Full movies. Movies that I thought were overly dark, I watched it in false color. Literally put my Odyssey 7Q on and just viewed it. Literally.
So I was going to say, you're on set, monitor's not lined up great and all that sort of stuff. And as we've talked before, what does that scope give you when the producer or director says, are we okay? Are we okay here?
Yeah, Matt can attest to this too, being in post. It's like, you kind of start to have these shorthands because you create this confidence for yourself. Because what these cameras, these scopes are telling you. It's like, it becomes kind of a doctrine that you can kind of go to where it's like, yeah, it's in. It's green. It looks good to me. And they're like, okay.
And another note too, just a trick, because Justyn can control what's happening in post. Because if we saw the picture that was there with the bright lights behind the boy and the girl, there's bright lights behind, which is sitting about 100 IRE, and it's like, go ahead. You want to lift everything up?
That's a big trick that we do, and at least me and my team do. We always put something in the image that's like burning out, so that you can't do like an overall crank of brightness, because now you're going to clip your image. Question. Let's see. White shirt. Yeah.
Thank you. I just had a question about when you're using those IRE ranges for skin tones, the 15 to 45 and the 55 to 70, are you referencing referencing it through a show LUT, or are you referencing the log?
Well, 55 to 70 was what I was taught when I was learning broadcast, right? When I was actually in school, that was like the standard, light everyone to 70 IRE. And for me, that was always too bright, because every time I shot a show and I watched it broadcast, it was overexposed. And I was like, why is that happening? So I started playing with that number, and it ended up going even lower than I expected, which was like 15 most of the time. So I'm still getting a dynamic range when it's printed later.
But just to specify, is that the monitoring you're seeing after you've had a show LUT when it's in a
generally, yeah, Rec 709. I mean, we usually, with some kind of show LUT plus Rec 709, whatever we're monitoring on set with. But yeah, that's not the log. That isn't the log reading.
Cool.
Yep. Was there another question over there? Yeah. In the front. Oh, in the back.
Hiya.
Hi.
So the question would be, you talked about how something that's really important, for example, when you've got very different skin tones in a room, is to maybe light the room first. So along that sort of line, I wanted to ask for, if you have a very limited budget and limited time, what is sort of lighting wise the thing to get right?
Take the most expensive light away from yourself and put yourself in the worst possible condition. Because I feel that when you're scared, you find more solutions than you do when you have the convenience of having the luxury of lighting it the way you want. Personally what I do is I limit myself so that, I can create, a problem. As it sounds kind of, counterintuitive, but it does create more creativity when you're kind of playing with that.
Cool. Awesome. Yeah. Thank you.
It's kind of like taking a cold shower first thing in the morning.
Absolutely.
Your brain is wide awake.
One at the front.
Related question. When you do have multiple skin tones in a shot, is it better to put different filters and colors in real life, or just fix it in post?
I used to think that. I used to think it was about lighting each one individually, but what I started thinking was, how do I relate it closer to nature, right? So I just started taking photos of rooms and spaces and understanding what these realities actually are in the real world. And then, for example, just looking at this, right? Some people might be dark, some people might be lit, the closer to the source you are, and then applying that to the practice.
Yeah, may I add on that? I get the question a lot as well. And how do you deal with various skin tones? And one of the things I'm most concerned about at this phase in my career is that people are different, right? So the amount of light that comes off of your hat is going to be very different than the amount of light that comes off of my skin and comes off of her pants. And we have to ask ourselves, why do we want them to be the same? We're getting better at this process now. But people used to, they carry around a light for the dark-skinned person, but the person is supposed to be dark-skinned. So I ask myself first, is it problematic? Can I not understand what they're doing or what they're saying? I have conversations all the time at night in the dark with my wife, and I know what's going on. I know what we're talking about. So she's communicating and I'm communicating with her. It's not an issue necessarily, right? So my first response is I have to check my gut. And am I responding to fear that my client is concerned? Because clients have a different version of, how to interpret success, right? But I do have to ask myself, what am I responding to? Can I really not see? Am I trained to think that this person's skin color is not correct or is not showing up correctly? It's supposed to be dark. It's supposed to be lighter. We work with an actress who gives us, a stopover what the light meter says. She's supposed to be bright. So I really want to make sure that we check ourselves first on a human level of what are we seeing? What are we responding to? It's okay.
And also just piggybacking off what Christian's saying is, treat it like being a painter, right? It's a palette, right? Each palette's different. Optically, if I'm standing at a monitor and then I'm looking at a person visually, I'm like, that person looks dark, right? And if it doesn't align on the monitor, for me, The trueness is making them dark, right? Or allowing or embracing that darkness or embracing that lightness. And that's just an aesthetic for me, right? It's the palette that I've learned by just experiencing faces, reflective surfaces over time, right? And that's ultimately what we're, interpreting in these scopes is just the palette that we're starting to build within our own mind.
Excellent. Thank you very much, sir. Okay. Next up, Matt Tomlinson. You'll recognize him by his name is on his sneakers. How cool is that? Matt is head of color science. Am I saying this correctly? Head of color science at Harbor, a well-respected post house. And what have you got to tell us about the business and what's going on in your world that you're interested in?
What I'm interested in, I'll trade places with you. Cool. Great. We're starting here. So I think this is actually really great. Thank you for leading me up to giving me a lot to talk about right here, because I think there's a lot of really cool information. Like, let me give you a little background of who I am in relation to what we've all seen here. I am the head of color science over at a post facility called Harbor Picture Company. My goal has been to work with colorists and cinematographers. I help build the look of the show. The look of the show, which, call it a LUT, call it a transform, call it what you want. The idea is to build the end before the beginning. So you build the look of the show, knowing that that's what you, at least right now, want your movie to look like, your episodic to look like, your commercial to look like. And from there, it gets distributed to on set, which goes into DI, which goes into VFX. The whole idea is that you have color continuity through the whole thing. And what got me super excited about joining this is I was just talking to Christian one day, and he just started asking me questions of like, hey, Matt, so what do I do when I'm on set and a cinematographer says, give me a neutral light? And I do, and he says, that's not neutral. And I went, oh, this is super interesting. Because up to this point, I've been kept in this closed ecosystem, which includes calibrating displays, which includes, setting all the lights appropriately. But now, and my function up to this point has been like, you start from monitor on set all the way to monitoring through finishing. But what Christian has said is take it one step further, take it one step before. And now we're talking about the human eye. And my premise for this whole thing is what you see is not what you get. And that's where I find this super interesting. So I wanted to start right here with the CIE chart, which I'm sure you are all going to see 6,500 times during this entire presentation or through this week. And the most important thing that I kind of wanted to show was that, we've got multiple color spaces put up here. I put the most known large format camera color spaces that we are all capturing. Of course, we all know that the rainbow section of it is what the human eye sees. And most importantly, the smallest triangle in this entire thing is Rec. 709. When cinematographers are viewing on set, they're viewing in Rec. 709. That is the smallest color space that we use. It's traditionally what we've been using since the 1960s. The good news is that 85% of what we see in the world fits inside of Rec. 709. The bad news is, for this conversation, LED lights far exceed what's going on. Those primaries go way past that. So, what does that mean? That means we are living in a world where we have to have that communication point of, I am lighting, I am a cinematographer, and how do we get a Rosetta Stone between ourselves so that we can communicate easily? We've got that between the cinematographer and the DIT because they sit around the DIT tent and they look at the imagery which should be calibrated, and we go from there. See what we got next. Not quite in order. So let's start here. Talking about white. Give me a neutral white. So I thought right from the beginning, what is neutral white? It's whatever you want it to mean. We are living in a day and age where we're in this world where a look is created by a colorist, a cinematographer, a director, and it has no bearing on reality whatsoever. We are living in a world where we have romanticized film, so we want blue shadows and warm highlights, but in reality, we can do things like we can make shadows that are 70 millimeter, skin tones that are vision-based, and you know what, we're going to make the highlights AGFA, but you know what, we're going to push it even further. That's physically impossible before the digital age now. So you say, give me a neutral white. I say, pick one. What we've got right here is we've got D55, which common vernacular is the white point for film. But Matt, I thought Vision was D53 and Fuji was D48. Yes, it is. But for common vernacular, people say D55. That's once upon a time, 20 years ago, that was neutral white. 15 years ago, D60, ACES comes around. 10 years ago, ACES comes around. They go D60 because that's considered neutral white. D65 at the time was video. That was too cool. D55 was film. That was too warm. D60 will split it down the middle. Now we live in a day and age because of HDR. We've all progressed where the concept of white is D65. We're Rec 709, HDR, we're all living in it. It just so happens that it's all D65. And now that to us is what white is. But once upon a time, there was also this green white that existed called DCI white that was really prolific for about a decade within digital cinema. And you pick what white you want to be. And that has nothing to do with the creative intent of what the show is. That's just a starting point of white is. So we get into this point here of like, not only just white, but skin tones, neutral gray. Where do they fall? They fall where we want them to fall nowadays if you are the cinematographer. Because if you go back to film versus the very popular K1, S1 LUT of the ARRI digital structure, and you use their output transform, their show LUTs, and you learn where middle gray is, they are different. The contrast curves of film versus what we now perceive digital to be are different. And this is an interesting thing because I've lived through it in the past 15 years when the first, digital cameras came out, the first ARRI camera came out and cinematographers and colorists were like, I can use this. I like this. We would apply the ARRI LUT that came with the camera and they go, this is not enough contrast, too soft. Because they were used to what print S-curve looked like. Over time, avatar happens, film goes away, digital takes over. Slowly but surely, people start using the LUTs that are from camera manufacturers. They stop using film emulations because they are not as prevalent, they're not as available, and people start doing creative intent instead of just trying to do an emulation. And all of a sudden, we're now living in a world where if you apply an actual S-curve of print, it's too contrasty. Because that's what we're now used to. It's all creative intent. And we run into this world here where, okay, so you can see where the curve intersects the straight line. That's where creative intent is involved. That's where skin tones are built. That's where you light through this and you have to look at a display to see it accurately. The display on this side of the screen is actually, the gray curve on this side of the screen is actually from a custom show LUT that we built where some of the people were questioning on set, whoa. The lighting's all wrong here, man. This is not good. And the cinematographer said, no, come over here. Pulled him in the DIT tent and said, look at the actual image. And they're like, oh, this is fantastic. If you're lighting through it and you're maintaining creative intent, it's what you want it to be. So what does that mean? I'm coming. There's a point. So there's another aspect of this that we're running into, and that's digital cameras themselves. And I love that you brought up like African American skin tones, because I will openly say, if you watch Blade 2 with Wesley Snipes in a dark tunnel at night is a modern lighting miracle. It is amazing how well it's done, but that was shot on film. And the beautiful thing about film is the darker you got you got saturation, you got color differentiation. There is a phrase that's kind of stuck with me that says, at night, all cats are gray. And I've used that throughout my career because what that actually means is all digital cameras, when they capture, the lower the image, the darker the image is captured, the less saturation you have to play with. You just don't have as much color to play with. It's welcome to technology. It's the big thing that everyone's trying to strive for is can we get color differences in shadows because they just kind of neutralize. And we're just the best digital cameras in the world. It's just what happens if whoever figures it out will win the Holy Grail. From there, I wanted to talk just a little bit about LED lights themselves and just how brutal they can be on camera sensors and also just viewing in a Rec 709 environment. So this image right here is actually one of the first images that I dealt with on LED lights where I was helping test out ACES when it was first came out, and they were just blowing out completely because the primaries were actually blasting through where the edge of the actual working color space was. So if you're aware of ACES at all, it's at one point they actually came out with a 3x3 matrix called the purple fringe fix. And that was 100% based on this because, certain colors within that spiky primary LED light where, we've got spike, and in between our eyes are filling it in. The camera is interpreting it completely differently. And basically what you think is a beautiful, rich image to a camera is just energy death. And it just blasts it. And it gives you, that's where you get quantization and solarization. So people have had to really pull back on things. And if you look at the more modern day and age, manufacturer built output transforms that are applicable to you, if you apply pure color on those things, i.e., Christmas lights, they blow out to white. They'll blow out to white, or what happens is they start quantizing really bad. Now, if you bring down the energy of those lights, you will get these beautiful colors because the sensor and what the transform can do will allow it to handle it much better. But what I'm saying is the LED lighting process, these systems that were built before the LEDs were really kind of fully in place, and it was just a lot for them to handle. So it took a little catching up for it to do, but now, like, I will work on shows where they will do, like, this is from a test of a show that we did where they were using a very modern camera and they just had LED Christmas lights and they were cranking them to 11. And we were like, please stop doing this. You're destroying the image. We're really needing to pull it back. And he's like, no, that's the point. I want to see how far I can go before I can pull it. And he racked down. So he knew where his energy level should be from these things because they're so intense. So along those lines, I started this with posing a question of like, how do we handle skin tones? How do we find neutral gray? How do we light in an environment where our eyes are seeing something that a display is seeing differently? Because there are LED lights, there is the camera, but there's also the creative makeup of what the show LED is. My proposal is, if you are a cinematographer, share your DIT display with your crew. Maybe gaffers should have their own display. Have something so that you can visually look at, because your eyes are going to deceive you at some point, because you don't know how stylized this look needs to be. And if someone says neutral, you may interpret it as D65 because that's the day we live in right now, but he may think it is D47 or D93. And that's just kind of where we live. And so I think having that Rosetta Stone is, I hate to say it, let's put more monitors on set, or at least have some place for you to go, for you to see it, so that you can feel confident and have that shorthand with your cinematographer. That's my presentation.
Any comments or questions for Matt? Anybody? Yes, sir.
So,
I don't want to make this sound like a sales pitch, but to meet your request, just to let you know, our scope software, you put it on your network and anybody can watch it on the browser or on the phone.
But to me, what you said is, I need something that comes out display space. Yours is coming out camera space.
Yeah.
And you're lighting to a nominal state, i.e. calibration.
Yeah.
So you're at perfection. Now, what we need to do is take it one step further from that so that creative intent is also involved. So if we wanted to come up with like a profile of a scope graph like you have that includes creative intent, that would be very interesting.
Yep. Well, we can actually emulate that look because I can actually flatten out the curve and basically put that look on top of it. And now the HS scope is emulating that.
Just to be clear, as long as it's only on the scope and not in the lights.
No, it's only on the scope.
That sounds very interesting.
And anyways.
Sounds like IP to me.
I don't.
Let's do it.
I don't want to make it.
Sold.
Somebody in the back there has a.
Hello, Alex. It's just a minor point. We actually didn't choose D60 because it was between D55 and D65. The way that was chosen was if you were to shoot a gray card on a film, daylight or tungsten, balance with the proper light source for that film, and then you print that at say 25 across, and then project that with a xenon projector and measure the lad patch on the screen, the chromaticity on the screen will be very close to the chromaticity of daylight at a color temperature of 6,000. So we actually have a paper on this. It's called The Derivation of the Waypoint of ACES. So it's all explained in there, but it just wasn't
Totally cool. I was just saying that common vernacular was taking that as to be neutral at the time. I hear you. I stand corrected.
Totally understand. Just wanted to clarify. We didn't just sort of pick it because it was in the mill.
Valid.
I have a question about the gray card, sir. This is me learning from other specialists in the room. So the gray card was part of that process you were describing.
Yeah.
18% gray card, correct?
Yeah.
The 18% gray, I have been questioning for the last 2 or 3 years and wanting to shoot something on what is essentially the reverse, whatever that is, 80% gray or, something like that.
Yeah.
Because I don't find it, a given that should be my neutral starting place for exposure. Does any of this have any value or make sense in what you're saying?
That's sort of a longer conversation about tone reproduction and what the value of an 18% gray card is. This is just talking about the chromaticity of the gray card through a system and what it ends up as a color on a screen.
Correct. At daylight 6,000.
Yeah. And if everything's sort of at the D10's position and runs through a system and you project it with a xenon projector, that gray card's going to end up about D60.
No, I agree. I'm going based on you mentioning the gray card, I'm going in a different direction. Do we need to continue using a gray card at an 18% gray card as a foundation of what we're doing?
It's a super helpful tool. I suggest it.
It has been. No doubt.
I hear what you're saying, but at a certain level, I would say we have to plant our flag somewhere.
Mm-hmm.
And if we do things uniformly by stating that, 18% is where we plant our flag, that is something that we could all kind of grab onto. I would be curious, like, as time goes on and you're thinking, like, what are different things that we could test to try to get there? Then, come on by and let's test it out.
Yeah.
But, I hear what you're saying. Like, it's kind of that, like, it's ground into the bedrock of everything, but at the same time, we are all a group of people and we are always asking ourselves, is there a better way? And I would be curious when you come up with that or, thought of process it, let's workshop it.
Yeah. I want to shoot something that is the opposite of 18% gray as my neutral home base as my space or something.
I mean, like, I find it interesting you would say that just because, like, part of, especially, like, this isn't this, but, you know, we get into the whole, like, SDR versus HDR aspect of things. And, you know, it's been my experience that the people who are, you know, when we first introduced HDR and there's all this dynamic range and all these things that we can go very, very bright and we can see things very, very bright. What's actually happening is everyone's going very, very dark. And so, like, if we can grab onto that in a stronger way, which is also very difficult because, you know, one of the things that, you know, if you haven't experienced, welcome to technology, all displays at the very bottom end struggle. They struggle. And, you know, if whoever as a, display manufacturer can really nail a neutral gray ramp that goes all the way down to the bottom, they're going to win. And so, you know, that's something to actually consider in this thing, because I think what you're talking about is like, you know, let's do something high. I'm just wondering if we're going to lose some steps at the other end.
I'm sure how much we lose will be dependent on how much people in this room embrace, and other people, of course, embrace that idea and work out the technology to be receptive to those values down there. Yeah.
One more question, if we have time. So in taking what you were just saying, I'd like to give you an example of what we do for live sports where we have an HDR production. We actually use mid-gray, get a relative level for mid-tones, but we also use diffuse white, which I think is going somewhere around where you're talking about, because that's where we start the knee point, where we actually perform compression when we do a simultaneous HDR to SDR conversion. And it serves as a very good anchor. Both serve as valuable anchor points, but for two different things. But I think there's great value in having both.
Nice.
Yeah, I've seen the same thing similarly in like Sony Venice, where they're higher bracketed ISOs kind of like play with that kind of line that you're talking about too, like where we're talking about seeing the brightest whites and that you wouldn't see like in clouds, and you start seeing details at the 5,000 and then bracketing it down to the lower end of like 250, starting to see some more detail in the black. But you're right. I think that is what video is starting to become, understanding what is that bottom and what is that top.
Yeah. I want to shoot the whole film like the Wesley Snipes in the Tunnel at Night. And where the brightest thing is, from, down here.
Yeah.
Yeah. 15 is the highlight.
Right.
And right. Okay. Comments, questions, anybody?
Two comments. One about the 18% gray. Of course, that's an old tradition, and it's based upon halfway up the logarithmic curve from black to white. You can look it up somewhere. And so I think that's the use for that. And so your other use for the knee would be a kind of a different application, but it's useful, I think, for exposures. I just wanted to, add that for a little historical context. 18% didn't come from, another planet. It comes from photography. Thanks.
From still photography? You said from still photography?
But I think, there's also a point where I think maybe we're blending a little bit of a discussion of scene refer space versus display space. There is the camera capture space, but there's also the display space where you have the knee and shoulder versus the 18% logarithmic curve. So it's depending on your perspective of where you're looking at imagery, you can have different thoughts on those things. And I totally agree with everything you're saying in that respect. I'm wondering if some of what you're thinking about is based off of what you're seeing on a display.
Absolutely. On display end.
Yeah.
Because as we mentioned, color doesn't exist without eyes. And, that's the point. Questions, anybody? Okay. That's our time. We're right on schedule, I think. So thank you very much for a great hour and a half. And we look forward to the rest of the conference. Thank you.